Well, critiquing socialism is perfectly fair. The question is there a significant socialist movement in the Democratic Party? In the United States, the reality is we have two strong parties, the Republican Party, the Democratic Party. So are the ideas espoused by the Democratic Party and its members in the House and Senate and recent Democratic presidents, are those socialist ideas or not? Because if they're not, the critique of socialism becomes sort of a straw man. It's a critique of something that is not really present or prevalent. And my argument is that there is almost no socialism whatsoever in the Democratic Party. I'm willing to entertain any particular socialist idea that has come from the Democratic Party or discuss whether any particular individual politician is a socialist, but I'm not aware of that. And I think that the misunderstanding about what is socialism, what is communism, what is social democracy, which is really, the furthest left that the Democratic Party gets in terms of elected officials in the House and Senate is basically social democracy in the line of Denmark, Finland, etc. If we can't even sort of understand what are the ideas, it's really hard to have a serious discussion about whether something is or isn't a good idea. And that socialism attack is inaccurate, and it's a very big distraction from really talking about how should healthcare be organized? How should education be organized? How should taxation work? And there's very little actual socialism to even argue against, but it's a good technique for the right to call things socialism because it does still trigger a visceral reaction in many people.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's talk about the definitions then, because I actually would agree with you that I think probably most of us aren't entirely clear on the differences between social democracy, democratic socialism, probably even a lot of people with like communism, fascism, capitalism.
Sure.
So do you mind like breaking down social democracy versus democratic socialism?
Sure. So in the simplest terms, and this is
fabulous.
Invariably, there will be people who disagree with my assessment, but I think that this is at least a good initial framework. Social democracy is capitalism. It's a mixed economy. It's an economy that is capitalist. There's private ownership of businesses. There's the ability to become very wealthy if you have a successful business. All of those things. It's a capitalist system that decides to prioritize use of government revenue, taxes, etc., to make sure that people don't get left behind, to sort of raise the very, very bottom, typically by imposing growing taxes at the very top. That's social democracy, generally speaking. So Denmark would be an example. Sweden is an example. Finland is an example. Norway is another example. And these are capitalist countries. There's private ownership of business. There's lots of very rich people. Some of those countries, in fact, are ranked as having better business environments and business climates than the United States. But it's the prioritizing of the money that the government takes in for particular purposes. Often it's healthcare, regardless of ability to pay. Sometimes it's maternity and paternity leave, whatever. Mm-hmm. Socialism is, speaking very generally, most of the time when we want to simply define socialism, we're talking about socializing ownership of businesses, meaning that businesses, instead of being privately owned, like instead of me owning my show and the ad agency that we run, it would be owned by all of the employees. It would socialize that ownership rather than concentrating it among the CEO, the founder, whoever it is.
And then they decide what to do with them.
That's right, exactly. Everybody together would sort of have shared responsibility over that business. And communism would be when the state takes ownership of the businesses. Now, there are gray areas. Mm-hmm. There are different types of communism and socialism, but generally speaking, that's what we're talking about. And with that very basic definition, it becomes very clear that there's very or almost no clamoring or serious possibility of, for example, a socialist president being elected in 2020. I mean, none of the candidates that are running have almost any socialist ideas, as an example.
Mm-hmm. So when we hear of the rise of a pro-socialist position in the U.S., you're saying that that's generally speaking about social, I'm getting the two mixed up, social democracy.
There's two things going on in the so-called rise of socialism. Mm-hmm. One is that there is a less negative view of socialism currently than there has been in the U.S. in a long time. Now, part of that is because the sort of vulture capitalism, as we call it, has gone awry in many, many ways. We can see that in terms of the level of income inequality that exists in the United States. We can see it in so many other ways, medical bankruptcies, et cetera, et cetera. So part of it is, even if one doesn't identify as a socialist themselves, certainly when capitalism is so boldly imploding in our faces, you are going to, logically, it seems to me, have maybe a less negative view or be more open to socialism. The other part of that, though, is, again, this confusion between socialism and social democracy. And on the actual issues, if you ask people how should healthcare be organized, how should taxation be organized, et cetera, most people are talking about social democracy, which is slightly higher taxes on the very wealthy, restructuring the relationship between individuals and healthcare to not run mostly through employers, but to run in a different way. So it is a lot of confusion about the terms as well.
Mm-hmm. And so, I mean, social democracy, and I think just the idea of wealth distribution in any sense gets a lot of blowback from people who don't agree with it, obviously. What are some of the critiques on that side? I mean, I know some that I've heard, but I'm sure you might even know the critiques.
Critiques of what specifically, though?
About the idea of distributing wealth instead of having, a total free market where everyone has their own money and they get to keep it and do with it what they want. And the argument that can help people, like freedom can help people flourish more than higher taxation and centralized programs.
Man, well, so let's see where to start. I mean, there's a lot of stuff in there that is sort of in conflict with itself. So let's see if we can break it down into a few pieces. One thing is, it's important to understand that the government and our society already is making decisions about how wealth should be distributed or redistributed. So when we decide as a society to tax capital gains, meaning gains on ownership stakes in businesses or stocks, for example, at a much lower rate for very rich people than wages, that is a way in which we are redistributing wealth from the middle class to the very rich who disproportionately are owning those shares of stock. So it's really important not to fall for the idea that the baseline is not redistributing wealth, but that taxing the rich slightly more would be imposing a redistribution. We already have significant redistribution. I'll give you another example. When we lower the tax rate on corporations from, I believe it was 35% up until 2017, under the Trump Republican tax reform plan, the business corporate tax rate went down to 21%. The country as a whole still needs the same amount of money and more to fund what we're doing, which is why the deficit continues to grow. So when you get less of that money from corporations, it's coming from somewhere else. Someone else is going to have to pay for that. That's already a redistribution. So it's really important not to think about this issue as, is it fair to go from no redistribution to redistribution? Because that's not the status quo. What we want to be thinking about is, what redistributions are happening right now? What are we saying when we allow companies, for example, like Amazon, to pay no taxes, and someone else is paying for that? Compared to, well, maybe let's make them pay their fair share. Maybe let's make the very, very rich pay their fair share. It's already being redistributed. The question is, how do we want to do it? That's really important to understand.
And so what about the argument that the more money that corporations, say like Amazon, keep, then the more jobs they can offer, the more, the higher maybe they can raise their wages.
Sure.
Things like that.
These are all very old and very tired arguments from what's called supply-side economics mostly. Some people call it Reaganomics, some people call it voodoo economics. It's basically bogus, and we can take each piece one at a time if you want.
Sure.
When we look, for example, at the 2017 Trump tax reform, businesses got a tax cut, like we just said, 35% down to 21%. It was sold to us as businesses are going to go crazy investing in themselves. Everybody's going to make more money. Wages are going to go up. It's going to be just so great. It'll all pay for itself. Obviously, it hasn't paid for itself. Deficit is record high. But what businesses did with the money was disproportionately just go and repurchase shares of their own stock. Who is that good for? Well, it raises the price of the stock. So the people who own most of the stock are the ones that benefit. That is disproportionately very rich people, hedge funds, etc., and executives at those corporations. So the idea that if as a business you get a tax cut, you're going to go hire more people makes no sense, because businesses hire based on demand primarily. And they have much more immediately positive ways to self-enrich that they would use those tax cuts. My business is an example. I mean, as a result of the Trump tax reform plan, my business is an S corporation, which means that the income it passes through to the shareholders. I'm one of those shareholders. Even though my business grew from 2017 to 2018 pretty significantly, my effective tax rate went from 26% to 22%. So the question is not, do I like keeping more of my money? Sure, right? I mean, in a vacuum, I'd love to keep 100% of my money. The question is economically, societally, what makes sense and what should be done with that. I don't go and hire more people because my effective tax rate went down. I would hire more people if there's demand for the product and service that I'm offering that justifies hiring more people. If you're Amazon and you get a huge tax break or a huge tax refund, that doesn't make more people want your stuff. That's why you would go and hire more people. So that's one example. And if there's others you want to go through, we can go through them.
No, I guess I think
those are all like supply side arguments that are very widely debunked.
But on that argument of, but maybe not hiring people, but would you consider expanding your business in any way? Maybe better equipment or, I don't know, bigger studio,
Sure.
anything like that?
Here's what's fascinating about that. A higher tax rate would incentivize me to do that more than a lower tax rate.
Why is that?
I'm going to try to explain this as simply as possible. If the tax rate is 30%, so let's back up even a second. It's really important to understand that business expenses are tax deductible. So if your business makes $100,000 and spends $50,000 on wages and equipment, whatever, you're paying taxes on the $50,000 that's left over. So when you spend money, you avoid taxes. If I spend another $100 as a business owner, that's $100 I'm not going to pay taxes on. What makes more sense as an incentive? For me to spend money to avoid a 30% tax, or for me to spend money to avoid a 20% tax?
Well,
I'm incentivized to avoid a higher tax rate. So very interestingly, this is one of the most widely circulated bogus talking points about supply-side economics. The incentive to invest in your own business to avoid taxes is higher when the tax rate is higher. Now, there's a limit to this, because I know that there will be supply-siders who will say, David, hold on. That doesn't work for like a 95% tax rate. You would just stop working. That's correct. All of these things exist within a normal spectrum, right? So nobody's talking about a 95% tax rate on businesses, but you are more incentivized to avoid a higher rate of tax by investing in your business.
so then so that's interesting. All right.
Your reaction, the look on your face is really important, because I have this conversation all the time with people and I see the wheels turning and people go, that's right, I would rather avoid a 30% tax than a 20% tax. The 20% tax might make me say, I'll just pay the 20% and pull my
Right.
profit.
And I'm not really pushing back. I'm really just trying to, because you're the first person we've had on to really dig deep into the details
Yeah.
of social democracy.
This is why it's
So
important to
is
talk about this
Absolutely.
stuff, because so many of these things, a talking point gets circulated and it gets repeated, sometimes for 30 years, 40 years. And only when you really start thinking about it can you start to kind of pull it apart and have these conversations. And what's really important is I have this conversation with people who very strongly push back against what I'm saying. But I have that conversation in a way that is respectful, it's polite. I'm genuinely seeking to find the truth about this stuff. And if someone came to me and said, no, here's what you're forgetting, David, when you make that explanation, I would say, that's really interesting. I'm going to go research that, because I actually want to understand the truth of these issues. And I think that there's a lot to be gained by really trying to pull them apart in this way.
Gotcha. So we've had on quite a few very pro free market people, and I think that they have a general issue with the idea of again, I don't want to use the word socialism, social democracy. How would you how do you concept?
I don't know what they have an issue with, because I didn't see the interview, but I'm curious.
Or
to know.
say, those who call it theft, right?
Okay.
What do you think about that general argument that why should my money be taken and used in ways that I don't necessarily want it to be used for?
Well, So, wow. I mean, so let's see. There are low tax conservatives who want the lowest necessary tax. There are people who go beyond that, and they are more sort of extreme libertarians who sometimes take the argument that taxation of any kind is theft or even slavery. Sometimes they will use that word. I find it, I mean, they're pretty out there, so I don't find myself super inclined to debunk that notion super specifically because I've done it a bunch of times. And if you're so far out that you think any level of taxation is theft, you're probably not going to see reason. But I think there's a few important things sort of to keep in mind about that. Number one is if you don't like the level of taxation in the United States or how those taxes are being used, there's lots of things you can do, right? You're not a slave, so to speak. If another country will have you, right? I mean, every countries have immigration policies. You could move to a country whose tax policy is more in line with what you like. You could choose not to work. You're not being forced to work. I mean, yeah, you'll have to figure out some way to survive, but again, you're not being forced to work and pay taxes. If you pay taxes, the government is going to collect the tax. You are, interestingly enough, I mean, I think the onus on someone who says that taxes are theft, the onus would be on them to explain how can groups of humans beyond several hundred be organized without some kind of central government. And a lot of really interesting anthropological work, including the work of, for example, like Jared Diamond, has made it abundantly clear that if humans want to organize to do anything in groups that are much larger than a few hundred, it's effectively impossible without some kind of organizing central government. And that's where a lot of these libertarian ideas sort of get stopped up, because they will often say, well, there will sort of be some kind of free market system that will decide who's in charge, and it will end up just being the guys with guns, which is one of the criticisms they often have of the government, that ultimately it's guys with guns that are enforcing stuff. Well, at least we've sort of elected them, right? I mean, we might not love the way our electoral system works, but it is a system. So I find it very difficult to really go through that logic with extreme libertarians, because they're typically unwilling to even entertain a lot of these ideas. But if the argument is a more sort of centrist one of, I don't like exactly how taxes are being used, that's something we can deal with. Let's elect people, right? We have a choice in who we elect. Let's elect people that will do what we want them to do with our tax money. There's other sorts of recourse. But, you know, the other thing is, more laissez-faire countries, more free market countries, so to speak, and countries that are more socially democratic, they all have taxes, and they all allocate them within a relatively sort of narrow range. It's relatively small differences that exist when you get to the end of it. And if someone just disagrees with taxes as a concept, period, I don't know that there's anywhere left on the planet that they can really go and have that be the kind of prevailing status quo.
Hey everyone, thanks so much for watching the episode. If you're interested in contributing to the conversation and supporting the show, there's two easy things you can do. One, click subscribe, and two, visit our Patreon page where you get exclusive access to the Exploring Minds community.